Welcome to Session 3 of this St Francis College short course, What Matters About Jesus. Session 2 was packed with big ideas, and we pray you enjoyed grappling with them. Session 3 deals with the social context of Jesus. What was the community around him like? Who was in and who was out? And why were Jesus' ideas about community so attractive to his followers and scandalous to others? Why does this matter to us now? The Reverend Penny Jones is Director of Formation at St Francis College. Get ready to travel with her through these questions, questions that matter.
I think the community that Jesus formed was really very diverse, but it began, I think, from a real centre. I suspect that it began with the people he actually already knew. You know, those first fishermen that he called, I've always wondered how he knew them, because you don't just get up and follow a teacher, however charismatic, at the drop of a hat, unless you've already got some relationship. And I suppose I've thought, well, he was a carpenter by trade, and they were fishermen, so presumably he helped build boats. I don't know, but I think there must have been some real connection. And so the first people that he relies on, I suspect, are people that he at least knew something about what type of person they were. So if you were Peter, you were a small businessman. We think of, these kind of ignorant fisher folk. Well, I don't think so. There's evidence in the scriptures that they had a small business. They had more than one boat. They had hired hands. So little small business people with a certain amount of entrepreneurial nature. So I think Jesus was very wise in some of the first people that he invites to be part of a core community. And so that would be the first thing, that they probably weren't unknown to him, in fact. But then he's expanding the community that grows around him. Very many different people. Some, indeed, were highly educated. If you think of somebody that comes to visit him like Nicodemus, there's a person of great intelligence and background. And in the centre of Jewish leadership. And of course, his cousin John, John the Baptist's father, was one of the priests at the temple. So, I sometimes think, did John and Jesus chase each other around the porticos of the temple when they were kids? I don't know. But I think there was connection into the religious high priesthood, the leaders of the Jewish people, perhaps more than we realise from the gospel accounts. So Jesus has got connections there. He's got connections into the fisher folk around the Sea of Galilee. And then he attracts all these others, mostly very poor people, folk that are really interested in a good feed, feeding of the 5,000. Here's someone that can get us dinner today. That's going to attract all kinds of folk. So there were people there who were sick, people there who were struggling to earn a daily wage, lots of women. So it was really an immensely varied community. And I think we need to realise that. It wasn't that there was Jesus and his friends and then these hostile people and then just crowds who were there for the food, the stories and the healing. Though some of that is true. There probably were those three varieties of folk, but it made for a very diverse and interesting community, I think. Well, of course, the gospel accounts are almost certainly written by men, which means that though the women are there, we don't know as much as perhaps we might like to about the role of women. in Jesus' community. But there's nevertheless more mention of women than one would expect in what's a very ancient historical text. So we know, for example, that there were women who simply accompanied him, and I think the scriptural phrase is provided for him out of their means. So there is a sense of accompanying women, and that would have been very unusual. Women didn't stray too far from their home environment, really, in the ancient world. So there would have been widows accompanying him who would have had some private means. And we know that there were important and significant women around him. Most of them, of course, are called Mary, which causes enormous amounts of confusion. I think there are something like 7 Marys in the text of the New Testament, so sorting them out is always problematic. Most significant is his own mother, and his mother Mary features beyond the birth narratives in a few spots in the New Testament. And I think to some extent, I think she must have been a bit of a pain in the side to Jesus. She would turn up and say, "You've gone mad, come home." And Jesus would say, "No, this is my family here now, this is the community." And of course she stuck by him all the way to his death. And then we know also about Mary Magdalene, who Jesus encounters after his resurrection in the garden and is the apostle to the apostles. She's the one that gets sent back to say, "Go and tell them what's happening." So those 2 women particularly strong in the narrative. And then there is Mary of Bethany with her sister Martha. And insofar as Jesus had a kind of home base, I think it was with Mary and Martha and Lazarus. And those 2 women, Mary and Martha, very significant in Jesus' nurture, in their care for him and support of him. So those very close women around Jesus. But then there are also a number of women whom Jesus heals. And I suppose most notably among them would be the woman with the issue of blood, who just thinks, if I can just touch the hem of his garment, I'll be made well. And so her story, she doesn't even have a name, does she, in the scriptural narrative, but her story teaches us later followers something very important. We only just have to reach out to Jesus and we find healing and wholeness in our lives. So she's a very significant woman, I think, in the narrative. And of course that wonderful story also includes the healing of Jairus' daughter. So these 2 women, one probably at the sort of menopausal edge of what it is to be a woman, and the other just coming into puberty, just becoming a woman. Wonderful narrative that is part of Jesus' life story. There is Jesus often gets involved with women who are not Jewish. Most notably, of course, with the Samaritan woman, the woman at the well. And talking to her at all is almost unthinkable. There's Jesus with her, alone. She's not Jewish. They don't normally talk to each other at all. So we see Jesus really overcoming divides of not just gender, but also profound divides of culture and religion in the conversation that he has with her. And then there's the Syrophoenician woman, sometimes known as the Canaanite woman, again a Gentile woman who's saying, "Can you heal my child?" And Jesus is quite rude to her. It's not right to give the children's bread and throw it to the dogs. So he's calling her a dog. And she's saying, well, even the dogs get the crumbs. And she calls him to account, actually. And I think it's wonderful to see Jesus be prepared to receive from women as well as to give to them. And perhaps a most beautiful example of that is the woman who anoints his feet and dries them with her hair. And again, here's a woman with no name who exhibits what it is to be in relationship with Jesus. That is intimate and profound at so many levels. So the women in the story of Jesus, even though they are often not the most active, nevertheless they form a really important part of the community that surrounds him. Well, often they're just described in the Gospels as the crowds, and the crowds is a pretty kind of amorphous entity. I would think that first of all they followed him because he was such a good storyteller. This is a day before television and iPhones and all of those things. There wasn't a lot of entertainment. So if there was actually a good teacher, an interesting storyteller on the block, I think people would flock to hear that. And also, I guess he was a bit controversial, and we know today, if you get someone who's got a little bit of something edgy to say, it will draw a crowd. I also think that he tended to speak up for the poor, against the rich, and against the powerful. And people found that interesting. Most of those who were tagging along were probably those who didn't have a lot. And so they found here a spokesperson who was prepared to fly a flag for them, who was actually going to speak up on their behalf. So I think that's why some of them followed. And then, of course, there were these amazing healings. And that certainly drew people to him. Anybody who needed healing or who had a friend who needed healing. I think of the people that brought their friends on a stretcher and let them down through the roof. Here was somebody who was offering help in a time when not much help was to be had from anybody. When life was very tough. Oppression under the Romans was not fun. And often people would find themselves enslaved because they could not pay their debts. You think of the power of something like the line that Jesus gives us in the Lord's Prayer, "Give us this day our daily bread." Well, that was a reality, and it wasn't just that they were going to go hungry, it was that if they didn't get that pay for the day, maybe they couldn't pay back their debt that day, and then they would be enslaved. So it was a very attractive message that Jesus was giving. A message that said, you're blessed, you're special to God if you're poor, if you don't have all the things that might make your life more comfortable and secure. You're nevertheless blessed and precious to God, and that was a very attractive message. Well, I suppose, if you were trying to form the perfect religion, you might look around and say, well, who looks like kind of pretty good and holy and would give a good impression? And Jesus really wasn't like that. That wasn't his first concern. He was truly looking, I think, at the heart and not at the outward, and wanting those who would speak on behalf of others, would speak up for them when they were in situations of oppression. He was looking for those who had real care and concern, I think. And he really wasn't bothered about people being pure. I think in Jesus' time, particularly amongst the Jewish leadership, purity and the keeping of the law very strictly was something that gave them identity, that enabled them to say, yes, this is who we are, in a context of occupation. They were occupied by a foreign power with very different gods and very different ideals. So for the Jewish people then, it was very important to keep themselves pure and separate. And one way to do that was by a very strict adherence to the fine detail of the law. But of course that can become incredibly oppressive, which is why Jesus accuses the Pharisees and says, you make heavy burdens, too heavy to carry, and don't lift a finger yourselves to lift them. And so he was trying to say, for example, that the Sabbath, that time of rest, was made for human beings, not human beings for the Sabbath. In other words, when God sets down a rule about having a day of rest, that's for the protection of human beings. It's not designed to make it more difficult. So that if, for example, his disciples pick grain on the Sabbath because they're hungry, that's because that's what they need to do in order to be fed and nourished that day. Okay, they've broken the Sabbath, they've worked on the Sabbath. But he's saying, well, that rule is not helping people to be whole, and actually the law is designed to help people be whole and free. So Jesus was more concerned with people's healing and with people's freedom than he was with their purity. Yes, I think it was true. And indeed, it kind of distinguished him almost from perhaps even John the Baptist, who got accused of being very ascetic. Jesus got accused of being a wine bibber, of enjoying a good party, and of associating himself with tax collectors and sinners, most notably with prostitutes. So yes, he definitely kept disreputable company. And I think that was for many reasons, but I think it was because he was open to everybody. And I must have found him very good company. I'm quite sure about that. I think about, Zacchaeus, who shins up the sycamore tree to get a look at Jesus. And Jesus calls up to him and says, get down here, we're going for dinner at your house. Well, I mean, that must have just caused the more kind of righteous and pure in the crowd around him to have gasped with horror, because, first of all, he's talking to this person who is a collaborator with the Romans, so, this isn't good. To break bread with somebody who was regarded as a sinner was a big deal. It would have been shaming in that culture. So off he goes and has dinner with Zacchaeus, and of course that helps him to open his heart and to change his life. And Jesus is able to just sit down and break bread with people. And that makes such an enormous difference. And he calls others to account. When he goes to the house of Simon the Pharisee, to be distinguished from Simon Peter the disciple, Simon the Pharisee, and he's enjoying dinner, and along comes this woman who proceeds to, anoint him, and Simon's horrified, and he's saying, well, hold on a minute, you haven't washed my feet, you haven't made me welcome, but this woman who is being identified somewhere in the background of that story as a prostitute, she's done all those things. So what is it to be hospitable? I think Jesus often is asking questions about hospitality. Who do we entertain, and who entertains us, and how? What is it to break bread together? And who do we exclude from our table for no good reason? Well, I think Jesus essentially hung out with everybody. And after all, the community was not that large. We think of massive cities. Even Jerusalem was not that big. And he was traveling about on foot. And I think he was the kind of person who spoke to everyone, who assumed that others would be willing to engage in conversation, and who certainly didn't put off others when they engaged in conversation with him. And so he doesn't send people away. Often his disciples will be saying, for goodness sake, send them away. And he'll say, no, let's engage with this person. So why does he do that? Because he sees them as a fellow human being. He sees them as equally valuable to God. If we think about who he sets as most important, well, he takes a child and puts a child in the middle of the company and says, unless you become like this, you can't enter the kingdom of heaven. Well, these days we value children. You know, we buy them toys and lovely clothes and everything's about the children. It wasn't like that in Jesus' day. In Jesus' day, you know, you barely had a name till you were sort of old enough to work and do something useful. You certainly didn't have a voice. You were not regarded as of any importance whatsoever, which is why it says in the scriptures, people were bringing even infants to him to bless. And the even's very significant. You wouldn't bring an infant because who are they? They have no value until they can do some work. But Jesus is saying, no, they're precious. Every single individual is of value to God. I mean, it says in the Sermon on the Mount that even the sparrows are valuable to God. And that would have been a very countercultural idea. So I think that's why he associates with all kinds of people, because he doesn't differentiate. He doesn't see one person as more important than another. He doesn't kowtow to authority or try to make himself more important by associating with better people. He's happy to associate with everybody. I think that for those who had authority in the Jewish community, the teachers and the high priests and so on, a lot of that authority rested on their power to allow in or to exclude from the community. And so it was important to them that they had some fixed lines to be able to say, well, this is where the line is, and you're a sinner on this side and you're pure on that side, and therefore you can be part of us. And so their authority really rested on that ability to define sin. So if you get someone who comes along and doesn't seem too bothered about that line, then that's very threatening to your sense of authority, I think. But of course, Jesus really called them out on that with the woman who was caught in adultery, because he turns around to them and says, yeah, okay, that's your rule, that's the line, such a woman shall be stoned. Well, the first one of you who hasn't sinned, cast the first stone. And they realize, of course, that we all sin. And so they kind of creep away and the woman's left on her own. And so Jesus says to her, has none condemned you? And she says no. And he says, well, go and don't sin anymore. In other words, don't do the thing that is harmful to you. So he's quite happy to name that, but at the same time recognize we don't judge here. And he says in different ways in so many places, judge not that you be not judged. So he has a very different way of understanding how this is to be handled. Jesus is always saying, don't judge. There's only one judge. That would be God. Don't judge each other. And for those in authority, they were judging each other because by being able to say, well, you know, I'm not like others, you know, as the Pharisee does in the temple, I keep the law, then that gives them status. And Jesus really wasn't very bothered about status. He was about how we are with God. I think I find Jesus' approach really appealing because it allows everybody to be themselves and it doesn't exclude anyone. I guess I was raised in an English home where, you know, rules and distinctions of class and education were kind of dinned into me as important as a child, because that was the kind of environment. My parents were struggling out of the sort of working class into the lower middle classes, and the only way you get there is by education, and you need to mind your P's and Q's. And I understood where they were coming from. They had had a hard struggle. But at the same time, it seemed to me that it excluded so many people. And so for me, encountering Jesus as I did through my schooling, and then eventually through university, I just found that he was someone that seemed happy to talk to anyone. You didn't have to cross the street, because we don't talk to people like that. And I found that really not just refreshing, but I guess challenging to some of the ways that I've been brought up, and also just open the world up. You know, you can talk to anybody. You don't have to decide that no, we keep our front door closed to all but people of a certain kind.